What's something your parents did that would be considered crazy now? I was 8 years old when my parents accidentally put me on the National Center for Missing Children database, triggering a nationwide manhunt that lasted 3 days and destroyed our family's reputation in our small Montana town, all because they thought it would be educational to let me hitchhike home from school. It started as one of my dad's character-building experiments in the fall of 1987. Dad was a philosophy professor at the local college who believed modern children were too sheltered and needed to develop self-reliance through controlled risk-taking. He'd grown up in rural Idaho in the 1950s, walking miles to school and spending entire summers unsupervised in the wilderness. Mom, who'd been raised on a commune in Oregon, agreed that conventional parenting was creating weak, dependent children. They'd already implemented several unconventional policies in our household. I'd been doing my own laundry since age 6, cooking simple meals since 7, and managing a small budget for school supplies and clothing. While other kids my age were driven everywhere by their parents, I walked or biked to school, the library, and friends' houses regardless of weather. Independence can't be taught, Dad would say during his weekend lectures at the kitchen table. It has to be earned through experience. The hitchhiking experiment began on a Tuesday morning in October. I'd missed the school bus after staying up late working on a science project about local geology that required collecting rock samples from different elevations around our mountain town of Cedar Falls. Dad was grading papers and couldn't drive me to school, so I walked the 2 miles to Lincoln Elementary. That afternoon, Dad picked me up as usual, but during the drive home, he pulled over at a scenic overlook about a mile from our house. "Tommy, I want you to try something today," he said, turning off the engine. "I'm going to let you hitchhike home from here. It's perfectly safe. This road only leads to our neighborhood, and everyone who drives it lives nearby." I felt excited and terrified at the same time. Hitchhiking seemed like something adventurous older kids did, not 8-year-olds with gap-toothed grins and superhero backpacks. What if nobody stops? Then you walk, but someone will stop. People in Cedar Falls look out for each other. Dad got out and opened my door. "Remember what we've taught you about reading people. Trust your instincts. If someone makes you uncomfortable, don't get in their car. And if you do get a ride, sit behind the driver where you can see their hands and reach the door handle." I stood on the shoulder of Mountain View Road, holding my thumb out like I'd seen in movies. Dad drove away slowly, watching me in his rearview mirror until he disappeared around the curve toward our house. For 20 minutes, only 3 cars passed. The first was Mrs. Henderson, our elderly neighbor, but she didn't see me standing partially hidden behind a road sign. The second car slowed down, but when the driver saw I was a child, he shook his head and kept going. The third car was a pickup truck that didn't even slow down. Finally, a blue sedan stopped. The driver was a woman in her 30s with short brown hair and a friendly smile. She rolled down her passenger window. "Are you okay, honey? Do you need help? I'm trying to get home to Cedar Creek Lane. My dad said I should hitchhike." Her expression changed immediately. "Your dad told you to hitchhike? How old are you?" 8. "Well, 8 3/4. She looked around, probably searching for hidden cameras or some adult supervisor. "Where is your dad right now?" "At home. He dropped me off here so I could practice being independent." "Get in the car right now," she said, reaching across to open the passenger door. "We're going to have a talk with your parents." During the short drive to my house, she asked questions about my family, where I lived, how often my parents made me hitchhike, whether they'd done other dangerous things with me. I answered honestly, not understanding that each response was making her more alarmed. When we pulled into my driveway, Dad was in the front yard raking leaves. He smiled and waved, clearly pleased that his experiment had worked exactly as planned. The woman got out of her car and marched toward him with determination I'd never seen in an adult who wasn't my teacher. "Are you this child's father?" "Yes, I'm Richard Thompson. Thanks for giving Tommy a ride. How did he do as a passenger?" "Sir, are you aware that you just endangered your son's life?" Dad's smile faded. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." "You sent an 8-year-old child to hitchhike on a public road. Do you have any idea what could have happened to him?" "He was perfectly safe. This is a quiet neighborhood road. Everyone who drives here lives. I don't care if this is Mayberry. You don't send children to hitchhike, period." Mom had come outside during the confrontation, drying her hands on a dish towel. "What seems to be the problem?" The woman, who introduced herself as Janet Mills, explained that she worked as a social worker in the county child protection office. She'd been driving home from a client visit when she spotted me on the roadside. "I initially thought he was lost or abandoned," she said. "When he told me his father had instructed him to hitchhike, I assumed he was confused or lying. Children sometimes make up stories to cover for neglectful situations." Dad tried to explain his philosophy about building character through controlled challenges, but Janet wasn't interested in his theories. "Mr. Thompson, what you've described constitutes child endangerment. I'm legally required to file a report with my department." "A report for what?" "He got home safely. The experiment worked exactly as intended." "The experiment put your son at risk of abduction, assault, or worse. The fact that nothing bad happened doesn't excuse the negligent decision to allow it." After Janet left, my parents spent the evening debating whether her reaction was reasonable or overly dramatic. Dad maintained that helicopter parenting was creating a generation of weak, fearful children. Mom agreed, but worried that modern society had become too paranoid to appreciate their educational approach. "Maybe we're ahead of our time," she said while making dinner. "Someday people will understand that independence requires practice." 3 days later, a letter arrived from the Department of Family Services requesting an interview with both parents regarding allegations of child endangerment and neglect. The letter was formal and intimidating, with official letterheads and references to state statutes about mandatory reporting. "This is ridiculous," Dad said, waving the letter at Mom. "We're being investigated for helping our son develop self-reliance." The interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the county office building. Mom took a personal day from her job at the library, and Dad canceled his afternoon classes. They dressed in their most conservative clothing and practiced explaining their parenting philosophy in terms that wouldn't sound dangerous to government bureaucrats. I was not invited to the interview, but I learned later what happened from fragments of their heated discussions that night. The social worker assigned to our case was Janet Mills, who'd picked me up on the roadside. She'd already prepared a thick file containing my school records, medical records, and background checks on my parents. She'd also interviewed several neighbors about our family's activities and parenting methods. According to Mom's later description, Janet had specific concerns about what she called a pattern of age, inappropriate independence expectations. She discovered that I walked to school alone regardless of weather, stayed home alone for short periods, and was responsible for several household chores typically handled by parents. She made it sound like we were running a child labor camp, Mom complained to Dad after the interview. "Everything we've taught Tommy about responsibility, she's interpreting as neglect." Dad was more philosophical about the situation. situation. This is what happens when society prioritizes safety over development. They'd rather raise helpless children than independent adults. The investigation expanded over the following weeks. Janet interviewed my teachers, who reported that I seemed mature and self-sufficient compared to my classmates, but also noted that I sometimes came to school with inadequate winter clothing or forgot lunch money. She spoke with neighbors, several of whom mentioned seeing me outside unsupervised at times they considered inappropriate for a child my age. The most damaging information came from Mrs. Peterson, our next-door neighbor, who reported that she'd seen me walking alone on Mountain View Road several times over the past month. She'd assumed I was lost and had been planning to call the police, but hadn't wanted to interfere in our family's business. Janet compiled all this information into what she called a risk assessment that concluded I was living in a neglectful environment where age, inappropriate expectations were creating potential safety hazards. 2 weeks after the initial interview, another letter arrived from Family Services. This one informed my parents that temporary protective custody procedures had been initiated, and I would be removed from their care pending completion of the investigation. The removal was scheduled for Thursday morning. A social worker would arrive at our house with law enforcement support to ensure compliance with the custody order. My parents had 72 hours to arrange legal representation and request a hearing to challenge the removal. Mom called in sick to work and spent Wednesday on the phone with lawyers, most of whom specialized in divorce and bankruptcy rather than child protection cases. The few attorneys who handled family court matters wanted retainer fees my parents couldn't afford on their combined academic salaries. Finally, she found a legal aid attorney named Patricia Gomez, who agreed to meet with them that evening to review the case documents. Patricia was a young woman, probably not much older than my parents, with a serious demeanor and a briefcase full of similar cases. The state's position is that your parenting methods constitute neglect through failure to provide adequate supervision, she explained after reviewing Janet's report. They're not alleging abuse, but they're arguing that your child-rearing philosophy creates unreasonable risks. What kind of risks? Dad asked. Tommy has never been injured or endangered by our methods. The hitchhiking incident is their primary evidence. An 8-year-old soliciting rides from strangers meets the legal definition of child endangerment regardless of outcome. Patricia explained that family court judges typically erred on the side of caution when children's safety was questioned. Even if my parents ultimately won their case, I could spend weeks or months in foster care while the legal process played out. Your best option is to agree to a safety plan that addresses their concerns while keeping Tommy at home. That means accepting supervision from Family Services and modifying your parenting practices. Dad rejected this immediately. We're not changing our educational philosophy because some bureaucrat disapproves of independence training. Mom was more pragmatic. Richard, if they take Tommy away, we lose everything. We can fight the case later, but first we need to keep our family together. Thursday morning arrived with unseasonable snow that turned our driveway into a sheet of ice. I was eating breakfast and getting ready for school when 2 cars pulled up outside. Through the kitchen window, I could see Janet Mills getting out of a county vehicle, followed by 2 police officers from another car. Mom started crying immediately. Dad put his arm around her and whispered something I couldn't hear. Neither of them had explained what was happening, so I assumed the police were there about some unrelated matter. Janet knocked on the door and waited for Dad to answer. She was carrying a clipboard and several manila folders, while the police officers remained on the porch looking uncomfortable. Mr. Thompson, I have a court order for temporary protective custody of Thomas Thompson. I need you to gather some of his belongings so we can transport him to a safe placement. This is insane, Dad said, but his voice sounded defeated rather than angry. You're destroying a family because we taught our son to be self-reliant. One of the police officers, a middle-aged man with graying hair, looked genuinely sympathetic. Sir, we're just here to ensure everyone's safety during the transition. If you cooperate with the process, this will be easier for your son. I finally understood what was happening. The adults were taking me away from my parents. I started crying and ran to Mom, who was still standing in the kitchen doorway. I don't want to go, I sobbed into her sweater. I didn't do anything wrong. Janet knelt down to my eye level and spoke in what I recognized as her professional voice. Tommy, you're not in trouble. We just need to make sure you're in a safe place while some adults work out some problems. I am in a safe place. This is my home. I know this is confusing, but sometimes families need help learning how to keep children safe. Mom packed a suitcase with my clothes, favorite books, and stuffed animals while Dad made phone calls to relatives who might take temporary custody. None of them lived nearby, and the legal requirements for kinship placement were complicated and time-consuming. I was transported to a foster home on the other side of Cedar Falls, where I would stay with a family named the Johnsons while my case was processed. Mrs. Johnson was a kind woman in her 50s who specialized in emergency placements for children removed from their homes. The Johnson house was clean and organized, with safety locks on cabinets and outlet covers on electrical sockets. Mrs. Ennerin and T.S. Johnson explained their rules during my first afternoon. No going outside without permission, no walking anywhere alone, always an adult within hearing distance. These rules keep everyone safe, she said while showing me the bedroom I'd share with another foster child, a 6-year-old boy whose parents were in drug treatment. I know they might seem strict, but that's how we protect children. The contrast with my parents' philosophy was stark. Everything the Johnsons did was designed to eliminate risk and maximize supervision. Everything my parents had done was designed to gradually increase independence through managed risk-taking. At Lincoln Elementary, news of my removal spread quickly through the small school community. Teachers who'd known me since kindergarten suddenly treated me differently, speaking in careful, gentle tones and asking how I was adjusting to my situation. My classmates were curious about why I was living with a different family, but I didn't know how to explain that my parents were being investigated for teaching me independence. Most of their parents had already heard rumors about the hitchhiking incident, and several had decided their children shouldn't associate with someone from a troubled home. The legal process moved slowly through family court. Patricia filed motions challenging the removal and requesting immediate reunification, while the state's attorney argued that my parents needed to complete parenting classes and anger management counseling before I could be returned. Anger management? Mom asked during one of their weekly supervised visits at the Family Services office. We've never shown anger toward Tommy. We've never even raised our voices at him. Janet explained that resistance to state intervention was often interpreted as hostility toward authority figures, which could indicate deeper problems with impulse control and judgment. The supervised visits took place in a sterile conference room, with Janet observing every interaction between my parents and me. We couldn't hug without permission, couldn't speak privately, couldn't engage in any physical play that might be misinterpreted as roughhousing. During our third visit, Dad brought a chess set and tried to continue the strategy strategy lessons he'd been teaching me at home. Janet intervened when he demonstrated a tactical sequence that involved capturing opponent pieces. Language about capturing and attacking might not be appropriate for a child who's experienced family disruption, she said, making notes in her file. It's chess terminology, Dad replied. Tommy's been learning chess for 2 years. Perhaps we could find a less aggressive activity. By the 4th week of placement, I was exhibiting what Mrs. Johnson called behavioral regression. I'd started wetting the bed, something I hadn't done since age 4. I was afraid to walk to the bathroom alone at night. I cried when she dropped me off at school and clung to her when she picked me up. The Johnsons interpreted these behaviors as evidence that I was finally feeling safe enough to express the trauma I'd experienced in my parents' care. Janet added them to her file as supporting evidence for continued protective custody. But I knew the real reason I was falling apart. I missed my parents desperately and couldn't understand why loving adults who'd taught me to be strong and independent were being punished by other adults who wanted to keep me weak and dependent. The case took an unexpected turn during the 6th week when Janet's supervisor, a woman named Carol Martinez, decided to review all current child protection files. Carol had been a social worker for 15 years and had seen hundreds of genuine abuse and neglect cases. After reading Janet's reports and visiting the Johnson placement, Carol requested a meeting with my parents and their attorney. She wanted to observe a family interaction without Janet present to assess the relationship dynamics for herself. The meeting took place in Carol's office on a Friday afternoon. My parents arrived early and sat nervously in the waiting area while I was transported from school by a different social worker. When I saw Mom and Dad in Carol's office, I ran to them immediately and climbed onto Dad's lap, something I hadn't been allowed to do during supervised visits. Carol watched as my parents responded naturally, hugging me and asking about my school day and friends. For an hour, Carol observed us interacting normally. Dad helped me with math homework while Mom braided my hair. We discussed a book I was reading and planned what we'd do together when I came home. There was no tension, no fear, no evidence of dysfunction between us. Tommy, Carol said after my parents had finished helping with homework, can you tell me about the day you hitchhiked home from school? I explained the whole experience, how Dad had taught me safety rules, how I'd felt scared but excited, how the nice lady had given me a ride, how proud I'd been to make it home successfully. Did your dad ever make you do anything that felt dangerous or scary? No. Sometimes he makes me do things that are hard, like cooking dinner when Mom's working late or walking to school when it's cold, but he always teaches me how to be safe first. Carol asked about other aspects of our family life: chores, bedtime routines, discipline methods, family activities. My answers painted a picture of parents who had high expectations but also provided guidance and support. After I was returned to the Johnson placement, Carol called Patricia to discuss her observations. This doesn't look like neglect to me, she said according to Patricia's later report. It looks like unconventional parenting that some people find uncomfortable. Carol reviewed the entire case file and concluded that Janet had overreacted to the hitchhiking incident and misinterpreted normal family functioning as neglect. She recommended immediate reunification with minimal ongoing supervision, but reversing a child protection case required approval from multiple levels of county administration, and my removal had already generated publicity that made officials reluctant to admit error. The local newspaper had published an article about child endangerment trends, using my case as an example of parents who prioritized ideology over safety. The article didn't name our family, but in a town of 8,000 people, anonymity was impossible. Letters to the editor debated whether modern parents were too permissive or too protective. Some writers praised family services for protecting children from dangerous parenting experiments. Others criticized government overreach into family decision-making. My parents became symbols in a cultural debate they'd never intended to join. Strangers approached them at the grocery store to share opinions about child rearing, government intervention, and family rights. Dad's colleagues at the college were supportive but cautious. Several mentioned that child abuse allegations, even unfounded ones, could damage his academic career and tenure prospects. Mom faced more direct hostility at the library, where several patrons questioned whether someone under investigation for child endangerment should be working with children and families. The financial impact was severe. Legal fees had already exceeded $5,000, forcing my parents to borrow money from relatives and cancel their planned summer vacation. Dad was considering resigning from his position and moving to a different state where our family could start over. Carol's recommendation for reunification was approved after 3 more weeks of bureaucratic review. The county attorney required my parents to sign a safety plan agreeing to age-appropriate supervision and conventional transportation methods for me. They also had to complete 8 weeks of parenting classes focused on child development and safety awareness. The classes were conducted by Janet Mills, creating an awkward dynamic where my parents learned proper parenting techniques from the person who'd removed me from their care. I was returned home on a Friday evening in December, almost 2 months after the initial removal. The house looked exactly the same, but everything felt different. My parents were cautious and tentative, constantly checking with me about whether I felt safe and comfortable. The independence training stopped completely. Dad drove me to and from school every day. Mom supervised all my homework and activities. They'd become the helicopter parents they'd once criticized, afraid that any unconventional choice might trigger another investigation. I struggled to readjust to being home. The foster placement had conditioned me to seek adult permission for basic activities like going to the bathroom or getting a snack. I was afraid to make independent decisions, worried that any mistake might result in another removal. School became difficult as rumors about our family circulated among students and parents. Several classmates weren't allowed to play with me anymore. Birthday party invitations stopped coming. I ate lunch alone most days and spent recess reading in the library. My academic performance dropped as I became anxious and withdrawn. Teachers who'd previously praised my maturity and self-sufficiency now watched me for signs of emotional disturbance or family problems. The stigma followed our family for years. When I reached middle school, guidance counselors reviewed my elementary records and flagged me for additional monitoring due to my history of family instability. High school applications required disclosure of any previous child protective services involvement. College applications became complicated when background checks revealed the family court records. I had to write essays explaining why I'd been temporarily placed in foster care and how the experience had affected my personal development. My parents' reputations never fully recovered. Dad was passed over for department chair positions and speaking opportunities. Mom was excluded from library policy committees and community leadership roles. They'd moved from being respected educators to being the couple whose dangerous parenting experiment had traumatized their child and wasted taxpayer resources on unnecessary investigations. The irony was that their original goal had been been achieved in the worst possible way. I did become independent and self-reliant, but out of necessity rather than education. I learned to navigate bureaucratic systems, advocate for myself in institutional settings, and maintain emotional equilibrium during traumatic disruptions. But I also learned to distrust authority figures who claimed to be protecting my interests. I became suspicious of adults who spoke in professional voices and carried clipboards. I developed anxiety around any situation that might be misinterpreted or reported to officials. 20 years later, I can see that both sides were acting from genuine concern for my welfare. My parents believed they were preparing me for an independent future in a world where self-reliance was essential. Janet Mills believed she was protecting me from parents whose ideology had compromised their judgment about child safety. The collision between these worldviews destroyed our family's stability and community standing, but it also revealed something important about how quickly good intentions can create terrible consequences when filtered through institutional systems designed to respond to crisis. The hitchhiking experiment lasted 20 minutes. The investigation and removal process took 2 months. The social stigma and family disruption lasted years. That's what made my parents' decision seem crazy in retrospect, not the philosophical commitment to independence training, but the failure to anticipate how their unconventional methods would be interpreted by a system built to protect children from genuinely dangerous situations. They'd assumed that good outcomes would speak for themselves, that reasonable people would recognize the difference between neglect and alternative parenting. They'd underestimated how quickly institutional momentum could transform a teaching moment into a child protection crisis. I still think there was value in their approach to building independence and self-reliance, but I also understand why Janet Mills felt compelled to intervene when she found an 8-year-old hitchhiking on a mountain road. The tragedy was that both perspectives were reasonable within their own contexts, but incompatible when forced to interact through legal and bureaucratic channels that prioritized risk elimination over educational philosophy. My parents did something that seemed logical and beneficial to them, but appeared dangerous and irresponsible to others. In today's environment of heightened child protection awareness and zero-tolerance safety policies, their experiment would be considered not just crazy, but criminally negligent. That's perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire experience, how quickly cultural standards can shift to make previously acceptable parenting choices seem not just outdated, but abusive.